Hello again, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the road to a gender-transformative UN Tax Convention. I am Lison Rehbinder. I'm Policy and Campaigns Coordinator at the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and I will be moderating the discussion today. As you may know, this webinar takes place within our 2 weeks campaign, the annual Tax and Gender Global Days of Action. This year, we are campaigning for progressive taxation for an inclusive and just social organization of care. And there have been many great events taking place every day this week, and there are still many more happening next week. This year marks the 9th edition of the Global Days of Action, and it's particularly significant as it coincides with the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, the 4th Conference for Financing for Development, and the official start of the intergovernmental negotiation for a UN tax convention. So these 3 key global events provide a unique opportunity for feminist tax justice activists to raise our voices and ensure that critical issues related to progressive taxation and the rebuilding of the social organizational of care are prioritized. The campaign this year is organized around 5 key demands. As you can read, they are on blogs that are published, that were published every day this week on our campaign's demand. And one of them is specifically about a UN gender transformative tax convention. So that's what we'll be discussing today. And it's a key subject for this year because we are indeed in a pivotal moment in our tax justice campaign. After years of campaigning, government will start negotiating this year for a UN tax convention. It's a great opportunity. And one of the key questions is how to make sure this text will allow for gender transformative progress. For this discussion, we have 3 fantastic panelists that will be discussing with us today. Today, we have Everlyn Muendo. Everlyn is a policy lead for tax and international financial architecture at the Tax Justice Network Africa. And she's been mobilizing a lot on the negotiation at the UN Tax Convention. So great to have you here, Everlyn. We also have Klelia Guerrero García, tax justice specialist at Latindadd, who has a great experience in research and implementation of policies, linking also gender and climate demands to fiscal mobilizations. And we have Tove Maria Ryding, policy and advocacy managers at Eurodad, and one of the co-coordinator of the UN Tax Convention Working Group of Civil Society, and the co-author of a proposal for UN Tax Convention published in 2022, which was an important step in our campaigns for a UN Tax Convention. So great to be able to discuss with the 3 of you today. Just again, to say to all of you spectators, viewers, that there's a possibility to have interpretation in Spanish and in French if you click on the globe icon on the screen at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any questions or comments, you can share them in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of the screen, and we'll take a time after a few rounds of questions to answer them. So thanks to you. And first question to you, Everlyn, to go in the subject. So now, how would you say current tax policies are disproportionately impacting women and reinforcing gender and economic inequities, particularly in the global south? Up to you, Everlyn.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Lizzo, for that nice introduction. Very happy to join an all-female panel, a funnel. And I'll respond to the question immediately. So I think we've had discussions in many instances about the implicit and explicit biases of taxation systems and how tax systems are essentially not gender neutral. And of course, there have been a lot of changes that a lot of countries have made to address the explicit biases of tax systems. But then the challenge is we don't see enough effort being put towards addressing the implicit biases of taxation systems. And the biggest challenge with that is, of course, in the first place, there is very little that is being done with collecting gender disaggregated data. But beyond the implicit and explicit bias, generally taxation is one of the most sustainable ways of financing a country. It's one of the most sustainable ways of financing development. And whenever a country is not able to raise enough resources, then it becomes a problem with delivery for public services. And we find that this impacts women disproportionately because women are the hardest hit whenever our governments, particularly in the global south, aren't able to deliver adequately with regard to public services such as health, education, and social protection mechanisms. So that's one thing. And also, as we speak right now, at least in the African context, we're living through another era of structural adjustment programs. We're living through, they aren't called ACPs anymore, rather they're called fiscal consolidation measures. So as a result of African countries not being able to raise enough resources, enough revenue to finance their development, a lot of them, particularly middle income, and I hate to use IFI terminology, but please allow me to, particularly middle income countries resorted towards debt as a way of financing. And it's reached a point where I think the Africa Economic Outlook reported that the debt to GDP stock of African countries is around, if I'm not wrong, 65%. And it was particularly on an upward trajectory from 2020. And the result of this is that the revenue that is being raised is now used to service the debts. So we have a situation, for instance, in Kenya, where 69% of the revenue in the previous financial year was actually used for debt servicing. So of course, the result of this is that it crowds out financing for critical public services for women, such as health. We saw the removal of the Linda Mama program, for instance, which was about making sure that women have access to maternity health care and also education, amongst other critical public services. The other side of this also, of fiscal consolidation measures and why they disproportionately affect women, is that we've seen countries resort towards regressive taxes in order to meet their revenue targets. So you'll find there's been a lot of increase in consumption taxes, either by essentially increasing the rates or just by increasing the tax base of consumption taxes. And of course, this ends up raising the cost of living of particularly lower income households and women who are impacted by all these tax measures, and not just tax measures, but by essentially a breakdown in the public finance management of a country. So in essence, we're being hit on all sides. We're paying more, but we're receiving less for what we're paying for. Yes, I hope I've managed to respond to that question, Lizzo.
Thank you, Everlyn. Thank you. Great explanation of a dire situation. I will now turn to Klelia to share with us on, yes, how does unpaid care work subsidize the economy, and how can tax justice help address this imbalance?
Thank you, Lison, and thank you also to the Global Alliance for Tax Justice for this space that enables us to exchange on this. When we talk about achieving gender equality in our tax systems and public services, we are envisioning a transformative change one that reconfigures the very architecture of our public finances, but also within our social interactions to correct longstanding imbalance. Gender equality in tax systems especially means that it is not about only ensuring that tax rates or benefits are applied uniformly. It is about rethinking our fiscal policies so that they actively recognize our differences and address the structural inequalities embedded in our societies. Today, tax policies continue to reinforce gender disparities, as mentioned before, by favoring regressive measures, austerity approaches, and other tactics that undermine the funding of essential public services that are at the backbone of care, from healthcare and childcare to social protection. In our current model, women and other groups and communities often bear the burden of these policies, both through higher relative tax burdens and by subsidizing this care work you mentioned that is largely invisible and undercompensated. Our campaign demand ensure gender equality in tax systems and public services, call for tax reforms where those with the greatest capacity to pay contribute proportionately more. And this is to generate the fiscal space that we need to build robust, gender-responsive public services. This is not merely a technical adjustment, it is a matter of changing paradigms to aim for social justice. When tax revenues are invested in transforming public services, we are not just funding hospitals or schools, we are investing in human lives, we are investing in well-being. This social infrastructure will enable women, families, and communities to thrive. Consider the impact of unpaid care work. In Latin America, for instance, women perform a highly disproportionate amount of unpaid care labor, and this is not so different in other parts of the world. And this contribution, of course, is vital to our economies and to the productive systems, and still it remains unrecognized in our national accounts. In Ecuador, for instance, we had one trial to measure this, but this was, I think, in 2014, and it has never been done before afterwards. So gender-transformative tax systems will indirectly acknowledge and compensate for this work, but how can we do that if we do not have information on what that means? And in doing so, we would help to alleviate the burdens that fall, as I said before, in a disproportionate proportion on women and other groups, to foster a more equitable distribution of opportunities and resources. Moreover, embedding gender equality into tax systems creates accountability and transparency, ingredients that in our societies are more than needed. By reforming our tax structures to eliminate those loopholes that are always found, right, and combat evasion, we can redirect those resources to build universal and high-quality public services that empower every citizen, particularly those in vulnerable positions. In essence, having gender equality in our tax systems and public services means breaking with the status quo. It means designing fiscal policies that fund our society's sustainability, dismantling gender hierarchies, and paving the way for inclusive, transformative, and really public investments. Thanks.
Thank you, Klelia. So yes, it's quite serious for us because, as you say, it's really changing paradigm. And now we have a big opportunity to do that with the UN tax negotiation being starting to be negotiated. So I'm turning to you, Tove, if you can just first explain to us generally why is this UN tax convention we are speaking so much about necessary, and what it can address all these global issues.
Yes, thank you so much. And indeed, thank you to the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, as always, for organizing some great days of action on tax and gender. Yes, the UN Tax Convention. Well, the first thing is we make references to important international agreements on gender. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action is one example. Many more times have governments actually committed to solving the issue of gender inequalities. The 5th Sustainable Development Goal is another example. And so generally, we have in the UN a lot of commitments. And we don't have decisions on tax because that was moved out from the UN over half a century ago. So in a completely separate process, mainly at the OECD, there's been decision-making on how global tax rules should function. And they have huge implications. The first thing is that when the decision-making is completely disconnected, then we also don't get the links to the issues that governments have already promised. And the second thing is that the rules that then came out of the OECD process turned out to be extremely unhelpful. Basically, the rules have been extremely ineffective. And what that has meant is that the largest multinational corporations, but also the wealthiest individuals in the world, have been able to use international structures to avoid or evade taxation in the national tax systems. So we ended up in a situation where the richest actors, it was less and less possible for governments to tax them. And that meant that it eroded things like wealth taxes and corporate taxes. And if you look at this from a gender perspective, the problem is, first of all, that among the wealthiest in the world, there is, as we know, an underrepresentation of women. Secondly, when the richest actors don't pay their share of taxes, that results in less funding for public services. And because of unpaid care work, it's often the women that have to carry that burden. And the third level, indeed, as the excellent other speakers mentioned, is that then governments tax whoever can't run away. And that's, for example, consumers. And when the governments use consumption taxes, then they impact women disproportionately hard. So the tax convention is a chance to change all this. Now we're drafting a new set of global tax rules, and we're doing it in the same house as where all the commitments on gender equality were adopted. So that is a huge opportunity.
Thank you, Tove. And yes, we are very excited about this opportunity. And the second question to you again, Tove. So now we have the TOR of the convention. And so the text negotiation we start for 2.5 years. And how would you think feminists can advocate to ensure it includes gender transformative provisions? I know we are also at the start of the discussion. It's a discussion that will be ongoing within the tax and gender working group. But we also see the risk of a gender neutral UN tax convention. So how would you think about that?
Yes, gender neutral, and there's a worse case scenario, which is that it's gender harmful. So this is an important issue indeed. And it's true, the negotiations are only just starting now. There's not a single letter written in the tax convention yet. So everything's still to play for. But we do have the terms of reference that were adopted last year. And these terms of reference, they're really a huge step forward. We're very, very happy about them. They talk about an international tax system for sustainable development. There are issues like tax and human rights that are being taken up, and that's also very new in international tax rules. And it talks about taxing corporations and the wealthy and combating tax havens and a lot of things that we're happy about. But we also tried to push the issue of tax and gender into the terms of reference. It's not excluded, but it's also not mentioned. They did not pick it up. And in tandem, we also pushed specific language on progressivity on tax systems, basically saying that those who have the most money should also contribute most in taxes. And another way of saying that is that tax systems have a job to do in reducing inequalities. That's inequalities between countries, within countries, but it's also things like gender inequalities. And this is not in the terms of reference. It's not excluded, the references to, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, but we tried to get a reference to the Beijing Declaration. It was not picked up. And why is this happening? Well, the first thing is that some governments are not in favor of this, and they will push back. But there were also a critical mass of negotiators that just weren't very comfortable. They didn't know much about this issue. And so the governments that would usually go in and support this, or at least they should, in theory, that should be all of them, because they all committed to addressing gender inequalities. But the ones that could be more progressive, our assessment was that they were not ready last year. We have a job to do in really bringing this to them, explaining this issue, and doing so right now when they're drafting the tax convention. And so one thing is to address international tax dodging and make sure the richest start paying and promote progressive tax systems. But there are also a number of angles on the tax discussion that are specifically relevant for gender inequalities. Has to do with how the money is spent on public services. And there's even a number of countries where there are specific tax laws that are very unhelpful for gender equality. So bringing all these issues in and explaining them and mobilizing governments to help us in this fight, that's the job that we have ahead of us now.
Thank you, Tove. We do have an exciting job to do for the 2.5 years that are coming. Just a reminder to all the spectators that you can ask questions in the Q&A box, and that we will go over them a bit later. And I go back to you, Everlyn, to discuss how what are these progressive tax policies that we can support that would help us fund care services, public care services. And do you have in mind example of such policies actually successful already?
Okay, thank you, Lizzo. So I'll answer the question within the context of the UN Tax Convention. I want to also thank the previous speaker, Tove, for the wonderful work that she's done in setting the ground, sort of. Yeah, so we've realized that in order to address the inequalities that are perpetuated by our unfair tax systems within our countries, it's very important to address the inequalities that exist between countries with regard to the international tax system. And that's really where the UN Tax Convention comes in. That we are the ones as women and as domestic taxpayers, because they often forget that individuals are also taxpayers. We are the ones who are bearing most of the tax burden. In our countries, we are paying much more taxes in comparison to our income than a multinational corporation that is probably has revenues that are greater than the revenue that a small country in Africa is generating. So for that reason, one of the solutions is really to transform the manner in which corporate taxation is right now, and also to advocate for fairer allocation of taxing rights between developed and developing countries. And essentially what we're saying, particularly within the context of the UN Tax Convention and the terms of reference, what we were trying to push for is that tax should simply be paid where economic activity is carried out or where value is generated. But even on this principle, we got so much pushback. We're also calling for the taxation of high net worth individuals who are highly mobile. And in fact, within the context of Africa, it was noted that around 28% of private wealth is actually held offshore. It's not held in Africa. So when we talk about the taxation of high net worth individuals who happen to be politically exposed persons, we're essentially looking at developed countries, you know, the Switzerlands of this world, and saying, you are the ones who are holding these assets for this person, and we want to get a share of that because we are bearing a higher tax burden than some of these individuals and, of course, the corporates. So those are some of the things we're really trying to push for within the context of the UN Tax Convention, because we realized that we can only make our systems, our domestic tax systems, more progressive when we address the issues that are happening within the international tax system. I mean, and addressing also particularly the governance issues, so we can make sure that international tax proposals are being made in democratic spaces where developing countries have equal footing and are able to participate based on a one country, one vote, unlike other participation systems in other international financial institutions. So we can stop just taking and implementing rules that really do nothing but increase administrative costs with very little revenue gain. So that's one example. I really don't have a real life example of where a tax measure that has been introduced in order to address gender inequalities has been introduced. If anything, I have examples of where it's not worked. And I'll just give an instance to really emphasize how the work that we need to do is, we need to do it at as I think Klelia mentioned, we need to see how fiscal policies can be a tool to address gender inequality. And I think beyond the implicit and explicit sort of framework. And I'll give an example of taxation of sanitary pads. I think the goal was to address period poverty by essentially exempting consumption taxes on sanitary pads. But then what happened is because it was exempted and not zero rated, essentially the manufacturers of pads, at least in the context of Kenya, were bearing higher costs. So what happened is the quality of sanitary pads really worsened. So on paper, you can say, yes, there is a measure that was meant to address period poverty, which is an issue that, of course, affects Kenya. But then when you do a little bit more digging, especially when you look at the campaigns that were actually run by Kenyan women, there was an issue with the quality. It became a bit of a health hazard. And so we really also need to encourage, I think within the context of coming up with fiscal policies that actually address gender inequalities, that we actually carry out more intentional research on some of these issues. There's barely any data to this day, after all the conferences, after all the communiques and the commitments, there's no data, there's no gender disaggregated data, there are no tax incidence reports on how fiscal policies affect women. And that makes our work very difficult, because then we aren't coming up with solutions that truly work in terms of fiscal policies. Yes. I'll end there, but I hope I've answered the question, Lizzo.
Thank you very much, Everlyn. Yes, for pointing also the needs to really support comprehensive policies. And yes, even in many IFIs, the gender has become a very key word. Sometimes we still, as you said, lack the data, which is really a big issue, to say the least. And yes, for also pointing out that there are so much you can do nationally, but there's a need to address international issues and international taxation. And we really hope the UN Tax Convention will be the place to address these issues. So now I turn to you, Klelia, to discuss again what it would mean to have gender equality in our tax system, in our public services. Yeah. Thank you, Klelia.
Thank you, Lison. Well, I would say that gender equality, as I mentioned before, in tax systems and public services means building economies that work for everyone. That is the basic. But this means that they should not only work for the wealthy, not just for large corporations, as Tove mentioned. Women, indigenous communities, and other groups, especially those that whose contributions are not visible, those are the ones that need the public system the most. And I think also it is about recognizing that tax policies are not neutral, that they either reinforce inequality or help dismantle it. And with the multiple crises that our world is facing today, I think history is demonstrating that we are doing the first. So I would emphasize in the mention that Tove did as well about the UN Tax Convention process being one step towards doing it differently. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity to change that. And for me also, gender equal tax systems will ensure that those with the greatest ability to pay contribute more, because as introduced in the care intervention, it is for sure that they have profited, to say something, from care the most as well, because all their workers, every link in their value chain, if we talk about productive systems, they need care to be sustained, they need care to function, they need care to exist. And then it also means ending progressive taxes that disproportionately impact lower income households, where women are overrepresented, and redirecting those resources into services, as I said before, like childcare, healthcare, and education. These investments ease the unpaid care burden that women disproportionately carry and create opportunities for them to develop in other spaces of the society. Also, tax systems need to acknowledge that women face unique economic barriers, personal conditions, even physiological conditions, and social restrictions. Only by recognizing that, we will be able to design policies that break those barriers down. It is about ensuring public services that are not seen as, expenses to be cut or something that exists, but we can't do anything about. I think we need to be compromised with understanding them as essential investments and infrastructure that supports equality and human dignity. Tax systems, a tax system that upholds gender equality would also value care work, both paid and unpaid, especially the second. It would allocate public funds to strengthen care infrastructure, improve wages and conditions for care workers, and guarantee universal access for these services. Public services are not just a safety net, they are a lifeline for communities and, countries and all the society. And gender equal tax policies would ensure that they are properly funded, functional, and accessible to all. Ultimately, gender equality in tax and public services is about justice, as I mentioned as well. We need to understand their collaterals regarding the redistribution of power and resources to create a society where women's rights are not negotiable, but fundamental to every fabric of our economies.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Klelia. I will go to one of the question we had in the Q&A box. So thank you, Valerie, for asking a question. You're wondering, shouldn't we also advocate for more women to be at the negotiating table of this new tax convention? Noting that there are too few women that are in finance, whether in the private sector or in government. And this certainly also negatively impact decisions made in taxation in terms of negative gender impact. So the role of, yes, women in policy-making decision. So I don't know if one of our panelists want to comment on that or share also your experience in advocacy. Yes, Tove, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Valerie, for bringing up this question. It was actually also a debate last year. Women at the negotiating table, the first thing I would say is that the women's groups, women's interest organizations, civil society, that's the first point where it's very, very important that the process is inclusive, because if we look at the negotiating table, there has been in the past decades a strong push to have more women negotiators. And one of the results of that is that you have some of the governments that are the most regressive on women's rights. And there are still some that are very, very harsh. They're sending female negotiators. And the role of the negotiator is to represent and read out and push a line that has been given by the government and by capitals and by ministers. So it's been a bit painful to see that the gender of the negotiator changed, the position did not of the government. And that's one point where sometimes the negotiator is not so much the issue as the position that is being read out and the decision makers that are behind that. And the criteria of how many women negotiators there are also ends up creating complications on another issue, which is that it's not constant which negotiator the country sends. And there is an important point in trying to influence also which types of negotiators get sent to the room. One thing that would be very helpful is that some of the negotiators that negotiate for the countries in some of the gender-related processes, be it the Sustainable Development Goals and the High-Level Political Forum or the Commission on the Status of Women, some of the people that really know the substance on gender equality, getting those people into the room, that would create a different dynamics. If we do that, we most likely the result will be more women in the room. I think so. But it's just to say that right now we have female representatives in the room representing regressive positions. And at the same time, we have a lack of capacity when it comes to the knowledge about gender inequalities and the substance of the global commitments on this issue. So very important, I think, also to look really at which interests and which knowledge is in the room. And the last thing is that one of the victories we had last year is that the terms of reference really stresses the importance of civil society and that we should be part of the process. So hereby a warm invitation and encouragement to everyone who cares about this issue to come and join us on the front line. We're going to be in the room when this tax convention gets negotiated, and we welcome everyone who wants to help us.
Thank you, Tove. I see, Klelia, you want to add something.
Yes, very briefly. I would like to emphasize on something that Tove mentioned as well, but that we can do with like within our civil society sphere, and it is that participation is not necessarily the equivalent to power. And even though we are mobilizing for governments to change that and for other spaces to do that. The first space in which we have the power to change that is our own organizations, our own groups, and our own networks. And for that, I think power in that representation would also mean reinforcing what Tove said, to strengthen capacities, to provide information, to provide the chance to be part of the whole processes, not only in one or two steps on the way, because that drains some power, right, in the negotiation. So I would say the first step that we can make or take is within our own networks, organizations, and groups of mobilization, because every step counts.
Thank you, Klelia. Very good remarks. And Everlyn, I see you also want to intervene. So great to have all of you answering this very good question.
Yeah, just also to contribute my 2 cents, I think it's also making sure that the negotiators actually have feminist principles. I think we've had, as Tove has mentioned, women negotiators who are essentially there to just make sure that status quo is not disrupted and it's not affected. So sometimes there can be a lot of what I would like to say is doublespeak within these processes, especially when it comes to economic issues. So for instance, within the outcome document, the draft outcome document on financing for development, you'll find some countries expressing support for the sections that talk about developing gender responsive public finance systems, tax systems, but then later on in the same breath, talk about how they or not express support, for instance, for the UN Tax Convention, not express support for increased tax transparency, so that withdrawing. So it's also very important as we work on these spaces and as we participate in all these spaces, that we make sure we do a holistic review of what is being mentioned. Sometimes, unfortunately, very, very, very unfortunate. Even what we call progressive countries, sometimes what they do is essentially how do I put it? They essentially just use sometimes the more feminist provisions to really just look good for PR's sake, while doing nothing substantively to actually set up measures that can address gender inequalities or set up truly gender responsive fiscal policies. So that's also a challenge that we face. And I'll give a very good example of Canada. Canada, no offense to anyone who is from Canada, but I remember, and maybe I shouldn't be mentioning actual names, but I remember Canada is very positive with regard to, for instance, within the Financing for Development outcome document, with regard to the gender responsive taxation system section. It's very, very positive. But then when it comes to the sections on actually enhancing international tax cooperation for the sake of addressing the issues that we have with raising enough finance to finance our development, essentially, then you see them regress a little bit. And so that becomes a challenge. So I would say, instead of women negotiators, we need people who, yes, are women, but who also uphold feminist values. And I dare say also that I think we also need greater representation from Global South women negotiators. I think that would also something that we would really like to see. But yes, those are my 2 cents.
Thank you, Everlyn. And it has been also a pleasure to see strong women negotiators from the Global South within the negotiation so far, and also to point on countries who are doing this double speech issue. France is not very constructive, to say the least, during the UN Tax Convention, but they are proud to say they have feminist diplomacy. So we have this double speech to hold the countries accountable to. There is a second question in the Q&A box regarding the financing for development process. So we have a conference at the in the summer, and the question from Ashina is, how can we hold the line, or better yet, advance the cause for a gender-transformative UN tax convention within the ongoing FFD process? So I'm coming back to the panelists. I know some of you have been following the FFD negotiations this year as well. So what's your take on that? Thank you, Tove.
Yeah, I can try and take that one.
Great, Everlyn. Yeah, you've been on the negotiations.
Yeah, can you, okay, my internet is saying that it's unstable. I think I
We hear
touched
you.
on it. Okay. I think I touched on it in what I was saying previously, especially within the context of the financing for development process. It's by ensuring that negotiators know that part of delivering a gender-transformative financial system is also delivering a UN tax convention. I hope that's making sense, because what they will do is they will happily talk about transforming domestic tax systems and making them more gender responsive, but that's just where it stops. They don't talk about the how. They just stop there. So it's also by making sure that we adapt it, and we say very strongly that this is also part of transforming or of a gender transformative financial system. I think I know for a fact feminists have done such a great job with reforming the global finance, with the advocacy on reforming the global financial architecture. Over the years, feminists have done such a great job with issues that have to do with international finance institutions. And I think it's also very important that we do the same with regard to transforming the global tax architecture, because that pressure is not enough yet. We need to put more pressure in that specific area. I hope I've answered the question. Okay.
Thank you very much, Everlyn. We are going to approach the end of our webinar, so I will ask each of you one last question, and you can say closing remarks if you'd like to at the same time. And I'm going back to you, Everlyn. So we are at the beginning of the 2.5 year process on the UN Tax Convention. We have already 1 year behind us of negotiating TORs. What do you see as the key issues, the key challenges ahead on the UN Tax Convention negotiations to address and to achieve gender transformative convention?
Okay. So I'll try and answer very quickly. Sorry, I keep forgetting to switch on my video for the sake of time. Yes. So I think one of the key things that we need to do in this process is that we need to ensure we change the governance structure of international tax decision making. That was one of the main reasons why this whole process started, and we should not leave the table without really transforming the governance, the international tax governance, and really making sure that it's more democratic and that particularly developing countries have equal footing. I think there's a risk that we might not, that sometimes we focus on the substantive rules, which are just as important, and we forget that we also need to make sure that we're creating a really, really watertight and inclusive process for international tax rule decision making. So that's one. I think this now to go towards also the other thing is that we really need to make sure that we also transform corporate taxation as it is right now. I think particularly for developing countries, the international tax rules are not working. We are still using double taxation agreements that really erode our taxing rights and create so many loopholes that allow for aggressive tax avoidance, and also, of course, transfer pricing, which is so complex. And yet in a lot of countries, we barely have well-resourced transfer pricing units. So we need to simplify international tax rules as much as possible, and also make it easier to implement and more effective, because the complexities, the happier lawyers are and tax practitioners, because then it creates loopholes for just essentially tax planning. I think the challenges that we're facing is, number one, it's not easy to negotiate 3 different instruments at the same time. It's going to be really hard in terms of the resources that are going to be required, especially from the global south. I think number 2 also is the shifting geopolitical context. We're living in a period where there's an attack on multilateralism. We're just starting a negotiation for a multilateral convention, and yet there's a country that is withdrawing from already binding multilateral conventions that have existed for longer than the UN Tax Convention process has. So there's definitely an attack on multilateralism. There's an attack on international cooperation in general. And I think how we can face this is through a global South solidarity. I think this is when we realize that as individual countries, our bargaining power is very weak as global South countries, and we really need to come together in order to push for something to change. I think we should also really use the declining aid sort of narrative to say, okay, so you're refusing to essentially pay reparations, you're refusing to pay your climate debt, you're refusing to pay all of this, even an ODA debt, because there is. So we're not leaving the table with nothing. If you're really serious about domestic resources being the most sustainable way of financing, then we want taxing rights to the economic activities that are taking place in our countries. So I think those are some of the challenges and some of the key issues that we really, really need to look out for. And also just to encourage within the financing for development process that we really have to make sure that the G20, the financing for development process, all these international processes do not take away from the hard fought for positions that we secured, particularly through the terms of reference in the previous year. So I'm sorry if I went over time, but thanks, Lizzo, for that question.
Thank you, Everlyn. Always very good to learn from you. I go to you, Klelia, to ask you, so we have a UN tax convention being negotiating. What is the role that civil society can play in ensuring it's a strong convention and it strengthens public services financing?
Lison. So I think to begin with, I would say that the role that civil society has managed to kind of create by itself during this process has been brilliant. So a congrats to us on that, because civil society plays an indispensable role in ensuring that this and any other process as the FFD process not only strengthens public services financing, but also foster justice, inclusiveness, and accountability within it. Civil society organizations could act as watchdogs, holding governments and negotiation groups accountable for their commitments. When we continuously bring to the table conceptual and implementation loopholes, we spotlight these gaps and discrepancies that undermine any proposal that is being negotiated, then we are improving the process. Furthermore, when civil society kind of drives the democratization of policymaking, especially tax policymaking, when we engage in public consultations and advocacy, when we bring together diverse voices, and when we are actively participating into the conversation, then we are doing so. And the invitation is to continue doing that, even when the processes kind of change and adopt this more technical kind of personality, because sometimes that is not of our expertise, and maybe just, look for support in other organizations and actors from the networks that we are part of, because we need to kind of adapt and be resilient and be continuously active in every step of the way, regarding even if some of these steps do not feel comfortable enough for our usual way of working. I would also say that civil society contributes by generating knowledge from other ways or perspectives about how our societies are functioning and what is needed to improve. And these policy proposals can bridge theory and practice and offer evidence-based analysis on the impacts of current and potential tax policies. And there is also a call for us to articulate, maybe with the academia and within groups of experts, which we already are doing. But if any participant here is willing to be joining any network, I think that is also a way in which civil society can contribute, because the only way to kind of highlighting our approaches, our proposals, our mobilizations is to back them up with some, confirmed knowledge, and socialize it with governments and with other actors that go to the negotiation table, because that is also a way to influence them. Finally, through strategic campaigns and public mobilization, and that's why it's also a congrats to this space, because civil society fosters an environment of solidarity and kind of collaboration. And when we do so, we are stronger, we are more powerful, and we have more chances to be part of the conversation. Because if someone that is in one of the networks I participate in is on the table, my voice will be already there as well. So that is another call there to join forces and to keep doing that, because we have already done it. But despite any, limitation that we find on the way about keeping this cohesion alive, we have to continue to do that. Well, in summary, within the framework of the UN Tax Convention, we have both this kind of recognition of our success, but also this great challenge of keeping up to the process, and to keep bringing in the voices of our networks, and developing backups and support for our proposals, focusing more on the solutions and in the possibilities, rather than on the backups and limitations and issues that emerge on the way. So thank you again for this space. It is always great to share with you all and kind of learn and exchange a bit about our work.
Thank you very much, Klelia, for this lively contribution on all the tools we have and all the responsibilities and opportunities we have as civil society. We are running just a few minutes late. I will ask a bit quickly, that's okay, Tove, to share with us the key moments coming in 2025. It's an exciting big year for us. If you can share with us what are the key dates, and then we'll end soon. Thank you, Tove.
Thank you. Yeah, at the end of June and early July, as was mentioned, we have the Financing for Development Conference. There we have ministers, that's high level. They'll be adopting a non-binding document, so that's not as powerful as the tax convention. The plan we have is to push for good language on tax and gender in that document. But then, if there's one message from here today, it is that the work doesn't stop in Sevilla at the FFD conference in June, July. It starts. So even if we get great language, and I think there's a lot of good forces coming on board in the FFD process, then in August in New York, then the negotiations start on the tax convention. And a lot has been done in civil society on defining what transformative tax and gender agendas are. Now's the time to come and really push to get it in. And the last thing I'll say is that the work doesn't start in August, it starts now. For example, in capitals, Lison, I think it was great that you mentioned the French feminist diplomacy. Great. Can we get those people to come in August instead of the negotiators they sent last time? Really in capitals, trying to encourage governments to create a holistic process to prepare what they're going to say in the tax convention. There are good experts in the governments on gender issues, even on tax and gender issues sometimes. We need those people to be part of defining the positions of governments. And if some of them could come and attend the negotiations, it would be splendid. Same for civil society. As I said, we need all the good forces we have, and we have so many to really engage in this fight going forward.
Thank you, Tove. And so thank you again to the three of you, Everlyn, Klelia, and Tove, for participating today. So we have a big year ahead of us, and it's a pleasure to be in this fight together with you and with all the members of the Global Alliance and the Tax and Gender Working Group. We have a lot to achieve, but many opportunity. And so this is the end of this webinar. There are some more events happening in the Tax and Gender Global Days of Action. My colleague Maureen has put the link to the program in the chat. We have a closing event next Friday, but there are many events until then. I want to say also a big thanks to Maureen, who is the tax and gender lead at the Global Alliance, and to Alex, who is our comms coordinator, who have been really structuring this panel and preparing this webinar. So thanks a lot to the two women behind the scene. And thank you to all of you who participated. There will be the possibility, I think, to review again this webinar and to pursue the discussion. The Tax and Gender Working Group of the Global Alliance and partners will be discussing until August and for the rest of the year how to really be strategic on our advocacy and campaign for a gender transformative UN tax convention. So please join the conversation. And until then, have a good day, and thank you again all.